final episode of Huge Update Interview, number 9. I'm Alfie McKinnis, and here's Pete Miles.
Hi there, guys.
Today we'll be going and tips on Overland and content creation.
Hello.
Hi, Adam. So I guess the first question is, because you've been in the industry quite a while now, is how did the indie adventure begin?
Oh man. Weirdly and slowly. Uh, so uh, I guess I just turned 34. So when I was in I guess I grew up sort of in this weird middle space where like my access to like really good 8-bit computers was like I kind of like grew up slightly too late for that.
Hmm.
And slightly too early to kind of get in on like Game Maker.
Hmm.
So I had this like really weird hump where I did a lot of like FPS mods when I was in especially middle school and high school and even in college. And I took some programming courses, and what I really wanted to do was just work at a big game company. I didn't realize that small game companies or indie game companies existed because when I was in school, it was sort of the early 2000s, which was like the throes of like AAA uh, as a concept and as a like empire almost.
Hmm.
It was just so prevalent, especially in North America. And so I just sort of figured I was like, I want to work in games. I want to go work at a cool game company, and that's how we ended up moving to Austin. Is there were game companies here that I just was, in the early 2000s. Austin was
Hmm.
home to the good Ion Storm,
Oh,
um,
nice. Yes.
uh, Origin,
Yep.
uh, Retro Studios, who had just put together Metroid Prime, which I think is still the best thing they've made, and just this um, remarkable achievement. And there were some other smaller shops that were doing more mobile focused stuff. There were some GBA and DS games that were being made here. So we
Hmm.
were just like, this is the place. This is amazing. Like, these are bigger game studios, but they have this like indie ethos or whatever. And then all of those studios closed except for Retro. Uh, and
Is Retro still around in the area, or was it moved to a
yeah, totally.
different place?
Yep. They're still here and still doing really high quality work. They're doing Mario Kart and Donkey Kong Country and all sorts of cool
Hmm.
stuff. Basically, a Nintendo second party studio at this point.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
but yeah, so all the studios closed. But before they all closed, I actually couldn't get hired there anyway because I had no experience. And it was around that time that I started a couple of things. I started doing freelance artwork on the side. I was
Hmm.
sort of a self-taught 3D modeler and texture artist, and so I did some work on Flight Simulator 10, and I was working on sort of a normal software job with normal hours. It was actually like really satisfying for a while. Um, and then I started doing contract programming and I worked on like a satellite radio thing and like a Zynga Facebook game, and they weren't owned by Zynga yet, but they ended up being owned by Zynga.
Hmm.
That's how I sleep at night. Uh, and a bunch of other weird things, uh, and then I ended up kind of going solo as a sort of contract pixel artist and game designer and programmer in like 2006. And then by about 2008 was when we released our first iOS game. And in that intervening, and we had also lined up a really good advertising client. And in that intervening period, my wife was still working on like an executive strategy team at that same software company that I had been at. So we had like health insurance and all of that stuff.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, weird, clumsy, long path, but basically it was more or less I couldn't get a job at a real game studio, and by the time that I could, I kind of didn't want to anymore.
I guess yeah, because you had the independence, you had the skill basis now. And I'll be honest, when Al mentioned we were going to be interviewing you, one of the games that kind of came to my mind was Cannibal.
Oh, for
Um,
sure.
yeah, and that actually was a game that I loved playing back in the day, and actually inspired me to create a couple of my own free runners.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
But when you were making that, what challenges were you faced? Because I think that was the main game that kind of was the one that kind of springboarded you into the kind of the limelight.
Yeah, Cannonball was the the big thing for me for sure. The main challenge was I wanted to make all I really wanted to do was make something exciting, and I only had about 7 days to do it.
Wow.
Um, so like those things kind of came together and informed a lot of decisions that we were making, but it was also just based on um, several old abandoned game designs. One really ambitious, like Escape from LA inspired thing that I was never going to be able to actually accomplish. Um, Kind of like watching speedruns and playing older games, and really inspired by um, concept artist and I don't know if concept artist is the right word, but there's a guy based out of I think Sweden who just goes by Arnie online,
Mm.
and I actually forgot his full name now. But he does all these amazing. He's a really excellent artist, and he's done work for Pixar and on RPGs and stuff like that. But he also does these really thoughtful sort of game design things, and he sometimes makes little prototypes in Dark Basic. And I was really inspired by his work at the time, and by another largely British or European indie game called Thrustburst,
Mm.
which is not an endless runner, but it's a procedurally generated, long, like lengthy, permadeath, like Twitch arcade survival thing, where you're like flying a spaceship into an asteroid or something, like down this like crazy tunnel. And it's just really smart and beautiful and simple, and it gives you this really visceral feeling of excitement.
Yeah.
Like it's really actually like sweaty palms thrilling. Uh, and I was still am, but at that time, like very single-mindedly interested in like recreating that feeling. I,
The intensity of that kind of sweaty palms,
yeah, I think
quick reactions.
um, I think it's one of many things that games I think do better than most other things. Sometimes there's like an exciting movie scene where you get that feeling, but like the culpability, I think it's an almost um, it's
It's
something that
unique, isn't it?
you only usually get it from like sports, from like a real activity, and the fact that you can kind of like recreate it or make like a micro version of it in a game was just really interesting to me.
Mm.
Um, so a lot of things in Cannonball are basically throwing away, it's designed by subtraction and throwing out anything that interfered with a pleasant sense of speed or acceleration or excitement.
Refined down to this kind of core element.
Yeah, and I still have just a huge that style of design. The games that come to mind recently would be something like Devil Daggers
Oh
or
yes,
Thumper, which isn't out yet and not everyone's heard of, but um, I
I played
really,
that in Spain actually. It's a very interesting game.
yeah, and I think, I mean, I really like the way it looks and sounds and everything, but also to me it just has this really there's this really strong sense when I look at it that somebody, and I talk to the designers and they say this is what they did, but they just went through and threw away anything that interfered with this one kind of particular intense feeling or experience or whatever.
Hmm.
And like reductive game design is not the only way to build things. And, we're working on a thing called Overland right now, which is not reductive at all.
No,
Um,
exactly. Actually, that's what I was about to ask you about. Fast forward into now, really. For those who don't know about Overland, what is the elevator pitch?
Yeah, the X. We were at this we were at this party at GDC a few years ago. Not at a party. We were just like we were on like a street corner.
Mm.
We weren't even in a party or anything, and somebody just came walking past, and they were like, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" And we were like, "Oh, I guess we're here for the thing. We make video games." He's like, "Me too. Tell me about your game." And we're like, "Well," and at the time it was like one of the developers of Sword and Sorcery.
Mm.
which like the elevator pitch for that is pretty weird because it's kind of a mood piece and it's kind of slow and there's just like drunk, like probably on coke, like AAA like marketing guy, and he's like, "Give me the pitch. What's the X? What's the X?" Uh, and they were just baffled. They were just like, "I don't know, man. It's this slow, beautiful kind of thing, and it's got this." And he's like, "There's no way you guys are gonna make it. This industry's too hard," and like storm out.
I mean, his head explodes.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry. So the X for Overland is basically we usually say XCOM meets Oregon Trail, which is like really not at all what the game is like, but it puts people's like headspace close enough that it
Hmm.
counts. So you've got a little squad of people, and you're on this road trip across the sort of post-apocalyptic North America, and you are kind of in a constant battle of wits against the environment, which has sort of manifested these creatures that just want you to not be there anymore. And you're trying to sort of collect resources, and the farther west you go, the weirder things get. Uh, and so you're sort of trying to stack the odds in your favor and try to be ready for whatever is next.
That's very cool, actually.
And
It's almost like a
not a
grid-based system,
guess.
isn't it?
Yeah, oh, and we really inspired, directly inspired by. At the time, it was mainly 868 hack to use a really compact grid, so you can see the whole level at once.
Hmm.
Right now, all the levels are 9 by 9.
Yeah.
So it's a really small space, and it lets you um, kind of you can we're really interested in making like a strategy game where you could really easily tell sort of the overall state of things as clearly and as simply as possible. So, if things are going pretty okay in Overland, you can kind of tell usually. There's only a couple monsters, there's or creatures or whatever they are, and you can see your little characters and you can see the items that they're carrying. You can see whether or not your car is on fire. Um, and you can see that things are going okay. And if things are not going okay, that's also usually very obvious because there's dead people everywhere and everything's on fire and there are these creatures all over the place and there are no more cars. And I like that. Uh,
Visually telling the story.
yeah, telling the story, but also there's almost like an accessibility thing to that. Like, I don't think um, we wanted as much as possible. I don't like, we're not really sure yet if people who don't play strategy games will be able to really play the crap out of the game. It feels like when we've had it at conventions and consumer shows and stuff that that's actually been pretty true so far. But we wanted at the very least for someone to be able to watch someone else play and to
Hmm.
like discuss strategy and talk about what to do next, like you would with like a board game. Um, and
Totally.
board games have that great thing where you can just look at it and see what's going on, and kind of like discuss it and decide what to do next as a group. Um,
That's
and
very cool.
just love that vibe. So we're trying to bring a little bit of that, try to like have kind of a survival game and a tactical strategy game, but then like bring in this element of um, uh, a friend sort of lent us this term legibility, which
Hmm.
has become like one of the pillars of the design of the game at this point. We want it to be legible. We want to be able to look at it and see what's going on and understand the stakes and empathize with your little, you know, meeples hopping
Yeah.
around on the board.
That's cool. Reminds you a little bit of like Pandemic, the board game, a teeny bit.
Oh yeah, we are both my wife and I have played an enormous amount of Pandemic, and
I was right then.
it's
Fantastic.
yeah, it's like different. I feel like Pandemic is essentially like the root of a really tall tree that people just haven't explored very much. I think Overland
Hmm.
is one way to explore it, and we have a whole other. There's like a huge branch of things that we really wanted to put into Overland that we've like lopped off and is growing into its own weird thing now.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, that sense of the other thing that we basically just lifted from Pandemic, we had to do it. It's all rebuilt and uses different rules and everything, but that
Of
sense of
course.
the um, the world as a clock that's counting down against you, is how almost every encounter in Overland is structured. Um, every time you destroy or attack one of these creatures that's come up through the ground, they have this sort of like death cry thing they do, which summons more reinforcements. And it's usually for every creature that you attack, two creatures will kind of come to its rescue. Um, and so, kind of managing your aggro becomes one of the core strategies. And it's a really counterintuitive thing for a game with this sort of structure. Like, the normal way that you do this is you you show up in a new randomly generated level and you kill all the bad guys, and then you collect all of the loot, and then you move on to the next area.
Mm.
That's sort of the normal way that you would structure a game like this. And I think getting people ready, like having people be psychologically prepared to play a strategy game that has a really different loop, which is you show up in a level, assess the threats, balance the necessity for violence for self-preservation with the collection of resources before escaping right as things have just hit their worst, is like a slightly different loop. And it's one that like, we obviously feel really strongly about it. We probably wouldn't have spent a couple of years building a huge game around that core idea, for better or for worse.
Totally.
Uh, but it it has a really distinct feel. It doesn't really feel um, like winning a level in Overland frequently just means you were able to snatch almost everything before this wave of creatures consumed you. Um, that's
That's
like a really good victory state in Overland.
yeah. So it's not all about aggression as much about, as you said, exploring and assessing the actual level itself.
Yeah, and I mean there is, you will bludgeon a lot of weird barnacle creatures to death with sticks. Like, that is a thing that will happen in the game. There's still like slightly more of that than I think I originally set out to do, but it feels like that's what's the right fit
Mm.
for the game right now. But yeah, so we have to provide, like, it puts all sorts of weird pressures on it, because suddenly you want, like, what are some if you're trying to manage your aggro, we have to give the player tools to do that. And suddenly that expands sort of the equipment or the inventory items in the game to include a bunch of things that are kind of weird for this type of game or experience. Like, the notion of trapping or containing or managing your aggressors in a non-violent way isn't a place that strategy games usually go.
No.
Uh, and it turns out it's really, there's all sorts of weird stuff you can do there. So things like setting up essentially barricades or lures, or from like the notion of kiting from an MMO, uh,
Mm.
is these are all like actual, like, real basic core survival and aggro management strategies in Overland.
That sounds really interesting. Actually, combining a lot of quite complex mechanics into a almost board game like survival experience.
Yeah, and trying to like chunk these things down. Like, the ideal for Overland is, uh, if you're looking at one of your characters at any given time, you have 1 to 4 little survivor characters that you control, and
Mm.
you're trying to help them survive. And at any given time, um, I guess the situation that we're trying to produce is, if you've selected some character named Jane, and Jane has one inventory item, and she's standing in a particular part of the map, and the map is in a certain state, or this level that she's in has this clear visible state with 2 monsters over here and a fire over here and a searchable stash down here. Deciding whether Jane moves forward 1 square or moves to the left 1 square, being a really meaningful decision that changes the outcome of the level, uh,
Mm.
is kind of how every turn in the game works. So there's like
Nice.
very little fluff. Not every decision is life or death, but
Mm.
most decisions have these kind of long-term consequences where if you decide to move Jane to the left, that's going to shift the aggro on the monsters a little bit. It's going to put her closer to these other resources on the next turn. It's also going to isolate the other character. And so there's kind of all these sort of downstream consequences that
Mm.
are, they're not dice rolls in a XCOM-y sense. There's actually very little, um, oh, I wanted to hit this monster, but I only rolled a 60%, so the hit missed. Like we don't actually have anything like that.
Yeah.
There's just all this other, um, there's uncertainty that comes out of a future that's really hard to parse, but you still get some warnings and some inklings about how to manage it, I guess. It's starting to sound
Mm.
like a game about like the stock market or something. Uh,
Well, it seems like a game that's a much bigger project from all the previous things you've worked on. Is it just you this time, or have you got a team that's helping you out?
yeah, this is like a devastatingly huge project, and if I knew how big it was, I never would have started making it. I'm glad that I did because like I
Yeah.
really, really like how it's turning out, but I
Mm.
definitely would have, if I'd known what we were getting into, I would have made a much more sensible decision probably. Um, but right now, the team has two full-time folks on it, which is me
Mm.
and a woman named Heather Penn,
Yes.
who is based out of LA, and she's sort of graphic designer turned everything, and she's just kind of the other half of Overland at this point. Great designer, great. She's the art director, but also the lead artist, so she's producing essentially everything that you can see in the game. She's producing. We also have uh, we have had for the last year or so an ongoing a part-time audio person, Jocelyn Race. She's based here in Austin also,
Mm.
um, and obviously my wife Becca, who's the other half of Finji. And then we also, as of a couple of months ago, we took on a part-time contract animator who's a mathematician who's also based in LA, and this is her first game project. It's actually for most of our team. Most of our team is women, and for most of them, this is the first commercial project for them. Uh,
Very cool. So it's like taking on a lot of new talent and molding it around this project.
yeah, and trying to bring like it's I can't decide if it's like noble or like vampiric, but like uh like I'm a white dude in my mid 30s, and like the breadth of variety or um just interest that I feel like I can bring out of myself and put into a game um is kind of limited in some ways. So like I really like being able to bring new people into the game industry and to work on a project where they have revenue share and all of that stuff, and they have creative control and a lot of
Mm.
input on how the game looks and feels and sounds. Like I think that's just sort of fun, but there's also like a kind of a selfish thing where I think they're just in a lot of ways better at this than I am. They're less tired. They still remember like what it means to feel happiness. Like uh, like they just have a lot of energy and a lot of passion.
Yeah.
And
Do you find that rubs
sometimes I
off on
do.
you though?
Yeah, totally.
Mm.
Uh, I hope. We'll see.
Yeah, but it's good to see that you guys take some of those and you guys do together and give them this experience. Then I feel that they can teach them
Yes.
the line of something, and catch them to do it themselves. So collaborators and getting out there with one another from stories from those you don't have enough experience without being able to connect.
Yeah, it's a very classic like catch-22, and like on the one hand like I sort of get it. Like I get that you want to bring people on who um are going to be able to get up to speed real quickly and, contribute in the way that you want them to contribute. But I think there's um short of going off on a too long of a tangent, I think there in a lot of tech there's a really um I think, hostile and hazardous bias toward experience with hard skills as opposed to experience with quote unquote soft skills. And even calling them hard skills versus soft skills, I think, is kind of problematic. But,
Mm.
like a lot of the work that I do on Overland is I sort of serve as a uh, bad producer. So I'm trying to like figure out the schedule and figure out what order to do things in and what feature matters more than what other feature, and how soon can we get it done, and how do we break these up to ensure that there's as little bottlenecking as possible and all of that stuff. And um, that's one of the hardest things that I do on
Mm.
any day-to-day basis on this game. And yet uh, really broadly across the game industry. I think if someone says like, "Oh yeah, I work at blah 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 studio," or "I worked on this game," they're like, "Oh yeah, what did you do?" And if the answer isn't programming or level design, then if the answer is, "Well, oh, I was the producer," then I think the reaction you get from a lot of people is like, "Oh, you didn't really work on the game then." You know, it's more of a soft skill, it's more of an administration thing or whatever, and that's deranged. Like
Yeah, totally.
doing production well is so 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 hard, and is an objective, it's a thing that you can just objectively be good at or be bad at. And so like the thing, like we were looking for fresh voices for Overland team because we knew this was going to be a bigger project, we knew it was going to be expensive, we felt like it was risky to not have new ideas in the game to help it stand out. Um, and I had some ideas that I want to put in the game, but we thought, oh, well, we'll hedge our bets. We'll get these fresh voices. They'll have lots of new ideas. That ended up being totally true. Um, but we looked for basically, we had a pretty strong and continue to have a pretty strong bias toward people who are reliable, who are good problem solvers, who are good at communicating, who understand the goal of the project, who actually understand what we're trying to achieve and are passionate about achieving that, and who are good at putting the project before their ego and their personal tastes, and all of those things. And I feel like all of these tend to be lumped under this umbrella of quote unquote soft skills, when these are the things that'll make or break your project. Like if they don't know
Mm.
how to use Unity yet, that's a problem you can solve in like a week or two.
Yeah.
If they don't understand what it means to set aside their ego and collaborate on a creative work, that's going to go out into the world and sort of represent them as an artist, there are not as many YouTube video tutorials about how to address that.
Yeah.
Um, so when we're looking for collaborators, that's usually the thing that we're looking for. If they have technical skills, that's a bonus. That's cool. It's like,
Mm.
oh, you do have some background in this. So, we take that into account as far as, well, maybe they'll be producing the right format of files in a slightly faster time span or whatever.
Mm.
Um, but finding people who really really give a shit about quality, and um, have this sort of knack for problem solving, for looking at the big picture and trying to find places where, oh, if we make this one change, these four problems all go away at once. Um, those are things that at this point that I consider invaluable, and the people that we've worked with over the years who aren't interested in doing that or aren't capable of doing that, or don't value that or prioritize that are just, it's like throwing money into a hole.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I think
you
the
know,
way you're thinking about it is it's a really great and the way it should be. Really, to be honest, it's a shame that not a lot of other people share the same views. Because I totally agree. I think stuff like knowing Unity and other software can be learned. But as you said,
yeah,
if they don't care and if they're not going to put aside themselves to better the project, it's as you
yeah.
said, you're throwing money away.
I think part of it is just, actually, I don't know what it is. My theory is that it's just because it is harder to quantify,
Mm,
because these things are viewed as qualitative instead of quantitative, because um, it's sometimes difficult to assess someone's problem solving skills or whatever.
mm,
Um, it becomes more of a judgment call as opposed to like, oh, it says here you have 5 years of experience, you shipped 4 games, you know this software library, and that means that we can pay you this salary and we're going to expect you to solve 10 bugs a week. I don't know, like it feels like there's a way that you can kind of spreadsheet contributions from people, and maybe that's the only way that it works when you try to scale it up.
mm.
I wouldn't know. Like our team is 5, so
Yeah.
like we keep things pretty
Because of
hands
that,
on
you're
and
all very
pretty direct
passionate.
most of the time.
Mm,
Well, we have to be. If we weren't, we would just stop doing this because like it's crazy. We should just go get a
mm.
real job, like get get paid on time and get health insurance and
Who needs health insurance? It's overrated anyway.
right. Um,
I'm joking.
uh,
Don't worry.
but yeah, I don't know. I think I don't know. Different game companies will always work different ways and prioritize
Yeah.
different things. But like it feels, especially the last few years, we've had these almost the same experience over and over again, where um, people who are good at problem solving, um, if they're good at problem solving, if they're passionate, if they have taste,
Mm,
uh, and all these things are judgment calls. You have to sit there and talk to them face to face a lot and try to get a feel. And when you give an art test brief or an art direction brief, you look for this like uh, when they respond and send you back stuff, you look for, did they uh,
do they
like a
not
thing we
pander to
did.
your needs? I guess, isn't it? And
Yeah,
they
like a
actually
thing
kind
we
of thought about it.
well, we did this thing. So our hiring process has been like evolving, and it consists of um, uh, blind paid art tests is
Hmm.
kind of our core thing. Um, so rather than look at names, look at resumes, look at experience, et cetera, we write up a little brief, and um, basically we do a job posting. Everybody sends in their portfolios and all of that stuff, and we, uh, as blind as possible, will sort of look at the portfolios and try to determine who we want to invite to participate in an art test. And it's
Mm,
usually a pretty wide kind of toss, or a wide selection. We'll take people who have 20 years of experience, people who have 0 years of experience, and we'll send them all a brief. We'll say, hey, can you produce one animation? And here's all the things that we're really looking for. This is the mood we want to evoke. These are the qualities that we're trying to get. Don't worry about the model that you use or whatever. What we're looking for is um, a certain style and a sense that you understand what we're trying to do, et cetera, et cetera. And we did the
mm.
same thing for audio, did the same thing for art, and for animation, we had a lot of people participating. I think we ended up with, I guess we ended up doing about 6 paid tests for animators, but
Mm.
for there were students taking the test, and professional film animators. There's a whole wide range of folks. Not necessarily people who didn't have background in games versus people who did, and like one of the animators had even appeared to read and really care about our brief. Um, so it was like a complete no-brainer choice. It was like
Yeah, the one who actually
one
took
of
the
the things
time
in
to
Overland,
think about
yeah,
it.
yeah, like because one of the things in Overland is this sense of vulnerability, and like one of the reasons that one of the core game mechanics is like the level burns down around you, and this kind of there's this like unstoppable wave of things forcing you to go west. Um, uh, Part of that is this sense of vulnerability and this sense that you're not all powerful and that you're not a wizard or a space marine or whatever. You're just like a person. And so
Mm.
it's really, on a really fundamental, basic level, it was super important that the animations um, project that sense that these are untrained, scrappy people who are kind of improvising their defenses and not martial artists, not trained warriors, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm.
Um, and one person taking and the brief was like 90% dedicated to explaining that and giving
Yeah.
examples of it and all of that stuff. And only one of the animators even seemed to pay attention to that. And they happened to be a mathematician in the process of changing careers and going back to school to learn 3D character animation. But
Wow,
they
that
actually
does show
like,
you, doesn't it?
yeah, that they were the ones that actually gave a crap about kind of trying to sell the mood
Mm.
through the animations. And um, they have no experience. They have like three pieces in their portfolio or whatever, and they're doing phenomenal animation work that is really not the sort of thing that you normally see in a strategy game. Maybe it's a little closer to something that you would see in like Telltale's like The Walking Dead or something like
Yeah,
that. Um, but there's just this like scrappy human quality to it, and it's never a fight. Like we never ever have to like push back against this animator trying to make everything look cooler. Like they
yeah.
get the vibe that we're going for. Um, and like we had to get them like we had to spend a few days like okay, so we have to use this version of Maya and it has to export this certain file format and you have to put these pieces together like this, you need to check all these check boxes. Like that
Mm.
was it was like a few days of getting them up to speed on our export pipeline and file naming conventions and all
Mm.
of that stuff. But like I'll take 2 days of file naming issues compared to like years of a collaboration where they simply don't understand or refuse to um, sort of engage in the goal of what you're trying to produce. Like that's crazy.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Uh, yeah. No, no, it makes perfect sense what you've done. To be honest, it means that they are more invested in the project. They're going to care. Also, because they're fresh, do you think that kind of pays off because they want to impress? They want to show you that they're talented and that they can provide what you're after and get on board with the vision that you're creating.
I think so. I mean, I think I don't know. I know for sure like our average team member age skews pretty low,
Mm.
and our average team passion skews pretty high.
Yeah.
Uh, and that might just be correlation and not causation.
Mm.
But I don't think it hurts that they feel like um, this is like I don't know, like they have maybe it's just that they have ownership of anything like
Mm.
um,
Well, that.
the
Yeah.
animator's animations in this game are unquestionably hers,
Yes.
and the audio design is unquestionably the belongs to Jocelyn, and
Mm.
the presentation, just the general presentation and mood of the game, just unquestionably belongs to Heather. So um,
I think that's great
it's
though. I think that's the problem with the AAA titles, isn't it? You hear a lot of people that are working as a cog in the chain, and they just say they don't really care as much because they don't really have any ownership of what they're creating.
Yeah, and I think sometimes folks kind of are derisive about that and they call it like, oh yeah, they're just 9 to 5ing. And I sort of get that. At the same time, like if you've ever even worked peripherally with a AAA studio, it's like it's incomprehensible that they ever ship anything. It's
Mm.
like I contracted with EA for a while, and the notion that EA ever ships one game is unbelievable. Like
Yeah.
the size and scale of that machine and the number of moving parts that have to fit together is really really insane. And
Mm.
so like um, compartmentalizing and siloing and all of those things, uh, I don't know how to avoid them. And but at the same time, like I don't know. I don't feel cool like ragging on AAA devs, but there is like I think to some extent it is if you take the parameters of AAA development,
Mm.
right? A game with 100 hours of gameplay and a massive open world and a crafting system and an RPG progression and custom character animations for everything and dynamic day night system. Like some of this stuff can be run in parallel. Like if you're just like, well, somebody needs to make 3D models for like 50 different kinds of fungus for the forest so that the forest has nice variety visually, like
Mm.
that's kind of a thing that you can sort of spin up and run in parallel, and it requires a good producer to do this, but you can do it. Um, but then there are these other things where, like, the example I was using the other day is Cannibal was a game where there were about 5 major decisions.
Yeah.
Um,
What
that
were the five
was,
decisions then?
oh, it was, speed is what matters most. Let's throw away anything that makes you, that slows you down in a bad way.
Mm.
Um, and let's make the aspect ratio of the original web version like really extreme to help give you this kind of sense of speed that's really hard to do in 2D otherwise because you run out of look ahead room.
Yeah.
Um, and let's put in those crates because they do slow you down, but it's a really special exception. And when we put in the crates, we need to make city generation reactive because you're going to be changing your speeds. We can't just do like a constant increase in speed and difficulty. Um, and
Mm.
kind of that was about it, really. Oh, and then let's put in more believable hi-fi audio, even though the presentation is very lo-fi and pixelated.
Mm.
And that was kind of about it. In comparison, like just what to do with the trunk of a car in Overland
Yeah.
is probably about 50 significant decisions.
So, yeah, an insane amount more than the
And
smaller game
yeah, and that's just for the trunk of
of a
the
car.
car. And
Yeah.
like there's like a few hundred components like that.
Mm.
So and Overland in a lot of ways compared to I think a normal AAA game is still very purist and minimalist and very kind of baking down the possibility space into something more manageable. Uh, the there's at some point there's just like a factor of time, I think,
Yeah.
and it becomes really difficult to give every element of a game due consideration before putting it in. And not all games need that and thrive on that. I think it's to me it seems very unlikely that every single element of something like Skyrim received what I as a designer would consider adequate consideration as to its purpose and role in the game, but everything about the structure of that game is such that, if the design of a goblet in a hovel somewhere isn't adequately considered, it's fine because that's not the overall purpose of the game.
No,
Uh,
it still fits in with the world at least
yeah,
enough to move on and
yeah,
work
and
into a
like,
different section.
and some of the some of the weirdness and quirks of those games tends to feed back and be some kind of weird positive. Symphony of the Night is a game that I love a lot, and it's
Hmm.
systematically a disaster. It's way too easy. It has no difficulty curve. It's just weird. It's like a Swiss cheese of secrets and items that don't really do anything. But it all adds up to this sense of like being ornate and baroque and like uh, kind of decadent.
Yeah.
Um, and almost everything in that game fits together and like has that atmosphere. And you get it's a kind of a special and singular experience. So like I know not all games need adequate consideration, but I think when you're doing things where the systems are supposed to be consequential,
Mm.
so a game where finding upgrades is supposed to matter, and uh, deciding what to use your resources to craft or whatever, that's supposed to be consequential and matter a lot. Um, you know, I
Yeah,
think.
those key elements have to have more consideration than another area which could be movement, which might not play a big part in the game, for example.
Yeah, it might be fine that you're just kind of, um that you didn't build a really good double jump system for an RPG or whatever.
Mm.
But ship a game annually and have time, just the time to actually adequately consider the like 25 million kind of little lines that connect everything in the game to everything else is it's impossible. It can't be done. I don't
Yeah.
think. Uh,
Well, you'd be making a game for like
it's
100 years, wouldn't you? Considering everything, but then you'd have to consider something else.
Yeah, and I think it. I think you at some point you just have to decide to work on a different game with different values. Um,
Mm.
and so when you take the AAA premise or the constraints and the goals of trying to take this big group of people and produce a AAA game, to me, that just has these inherent things like that inherently means producing something that cannot have been fully considered in this way. And so I think AAA games that embrace that. So I would point at like Just Cause 3 pretty recently
Mm.
as a game that sort of seems to embrace the chaos. Uh,
Yes, very much so.
Just Cause 3, if the physics on something haven't been tuned to perfection and it doesn't provide a really consistent multi-contextual gameplay purpose, it's sort of fine as long as it has a cool explosion. Like because that's sort
Yeah.
of what you're doing, and that's not a slam on the team. Like there, this is I think this is the best you can do pretty much with your AAA parameters, aside from spending 10 years on the game. Because I think that's what you see from like Shadow of the Colossus team.
Yes, I mean, The
Is
Last
they're
Guardian's hopefully coming out this year.
Yeah, in theory.
Yeah.
But that's a team that actually they have these AAA specs and they're still considering everything and they're still designing
Mm.
through reduction or through subtraction. And I think those are your choices. You can
Yeah.
ship every few years and embrace the chaos. Bethesda's really good at that. Um, the I forgot the Just Cause studio now, but yeah, Avalanche I think is great at that. Um, and I think everybody else, it feels like, are trying to they're trying to do the impossible, you know, which is sort of um, like I almost want to like give them all a hug for like tilting at this windmill that they can never really do anything about. Um,
Mm.
uh, there's just too many. There's too many compromises. There's too many things to balance, and sometimes you'll see little bits like there's a little bit in the not the most recent Tomb Raider game, but the one before it. There's a little bit where Lara is climbing this like radio tower,
Yeah.
um, and it's kind of almost just a cutscene, but it's kind of also a place where you feel like the AAA formula is like really, really starting to work. And I actually think Starbreeze and Machine Games are both super good at this too.
Mm.
Brothers and the new Wolfenstein game, I think, have a really solid understanding about like what you can do in sort of weird cinematic game space.
Yeah.
And they tend to balance things pretty well, but they both also really deliberately kind of sidestep some things. And like the RPG unlock system in Wolfenstein is like pointless. It's just not interesting. It just shouldn't be in there because it's not what that game is doing well. You know, that's
Mm.
it's really clearly like a checkbox for acceptability or whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
What the publisher
but
kind of maybe wanted to have in there.
yeah, I think so. You got to have something because otherwise people
Yeah.
are going to get grumpy, and it doesn't feel fully considered the way the rest of the game design does to me.